We are very pleased to also welcome Lynn Feigenbaum, who is the chief of the Major Felony Bureau from the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in Massachusetts, importantly. She has served there for the past 17 years, and in addition to managing other employees during her tenure, she's also handled significant crime of violence cases, large-scale human trafficking prosecutions, and she is a frequent sharer of information with other offices on the importance of prosecuting workplace fatalities. She is here to share a case study with us related to her prosecution of a business and its owner for manslaughter and the deaths of workers who were in their employee. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for having me, and thanks to the Prosecutors Center for Excellence for inviting me. I am here. Thank you. I am here to describe my thing is not working. Oh, there we go. I am here to talk about the Commonwealth versus Kevin Otto and Atlantic Drain Services Company. This was a prosecution that resulted out of the 2016 trench collapse, which caused a fire hydrant to dislocate from a water main and flood the trench, which killed the two workers who were inside. I am joined in my office by Robert Carboni, lest you think that I've been just talking to myself this whole time. And Bob works for OSHA, and he was sort of my guru through the OSHA process. But the interesting thing about this case is really how it brought a lot of different people who, quite frankly, just talking to the state prosecutors out there who don't usually play well in the sandbox together. And so to Sophia's reference, one of the things that Bob and I do now is take our act on the road, trying to convince other local law enforcement that it is possible to work with the federal government, get discovery from them, and make sure that you can put together a prosecution. So I've listed some of the people, the Boston Police Homicide Unit, my office, the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, the Boston Fire Department, City of Boston, the Department of Public Works just being one of those companies. I'd also like to acknowledge Mike Glennon, who was a member of my office at that time. He was the homicide response person, who was the original district attorney on the scene, as well as Mike Grover, who was the compliance officer who responded in October of 2016. So before I get into what actually happened, I just want to recognize that, we did this on behalf of two victims, the first being Calvin Chuck Maddox. At the time he was 54. He is here with three of his daughters and his wife Priscilla, as well as Robbie Higgins, who is 47 years old, and his sister and his parents were there at every step of the way. So basically what this was Atlantic Drain Services Company was hired to install a new water and sewer connections in the south end. A brownstone was being redone, and what they needed to do was essentially dig two trenches, one on either side of the hydrant that you can see here. There was a smaller trench, and then this larger trench that had to go all the way out to the center, basically by the double yellow, in order to make sure that the brownstone had the connection that it needed. I've included this next slide here because a couple of days after the incident, Bob spent about 5 hours in my office teaching me about fire hydrants, how to properly construct a trench. And these are things that I would say most prosecutors don't really know. But one of the things that I did learn is that, we usually see this part of the hydrant, but this is what's going on underneath. And it's got this section and this that goes all the way out. And this is essentially at the double yellow. And this piece, I would say up to about there, was evidence in our case. And the whole piece weighs about 1,100 pounds. And when a trench is excavated properly, the sides of it are short so that the walls don't cave in. But also that means that dirt is going to stay under such a heavy piece of equipment, such a heavy, the ductile iron pipe. The problem is when you do not support this section here, is that this this joint can't hold the weight, and it essentially pulls out. So on the left is the trench 2 days before the incident. You can see how it's not properly shored on each side. OSHA regulations state that if you're digging below 5 feet, you need to shore up the sides of that trench so that it doesn't collapse and harm workers. So you can see a little bit on the left here how there was some stuff put in. You can see on the right that on the left-hand side on the right-hand picture, that's actually 2 trenching boxes stacked on top of each other. Both of them were broken. It was put together with, random nuts and bolts that I think Mr. Otto found on the side of the road. And on the right, you see some wooden shoring that's really just haphazardly placed in there, and it's so that they can make this connection down at the bottom of this 12-foot trench. When done properly, this is what your trench is going to look like. It's going to have openings for utilities to go through. It's going to make sure that the worker can get down there safely and not have the risk of a collapse happening. And because this is what happens when you don't shore properly. So this is that trench that you just saw, but here's with the hydrant now below sidewalk level because it has pulled out of its connection right here. And unfortunately, what happened is that after the dirt came into the trench, which basically buried both Chuck and Robbie up to their chests and made them basically stuck in that trench, the water from the hydrant then flooded the trench, and both of them were killed. We don't have a workplace manslaughter statute in Massachusetts, so we did go through an involuntary legal standard. I went to law school in Massachusetts, so I actually don't know how many law schools teach Wolanski, but that was the 1942 Coconut Grove fire where 492 people died because they were trying to get out of the Coconut Grove nightclub, but the fire doors were chained shut. I do see that there are a bunch of people here from Massachusetts, so I'm taking us all back to our law school days. But what we basically were saying is like, look, Kevin Otto and Atlantic Drain, you guys knew that this was going to happen. You knew that the danger that you are putting your workers at risk at when you did this, and you basically did it because time is money in the construction industry, and if you don't take the time to build the trench that you just saw, then you don't have to pay your workers for that time. One of the ways that we proved the knowledge that Kevin Otto and Atlantic Drain had was with their OSHA history. Atlantic Drain actually had 4 prior incidents, but the July 2007 and the June 2012 were basically the exact same thing. Unshored trenches where workers were working at the risk of having a trench collapse on them. So the first one was July 2007 on the corner of Boylston and Charles Streets. I mentioned earlier that Mike Grover was the compliance officer that worked on the South End trench case, but he was also the compliance officer that responded in July 2007 to this site. And as you can see here, they were digging right outside of a hotel, the Four Seasons Hotel. Thank you, Bob. And you know, it's a trench over 5 feet. There's an undermined sidewalk. And these are the pictures that Mike took. The person actually holding the trench rod back in 2007 is Chuck Maddox. He was working for Atlantic Drain all the way back then. And when Mike arrived on scene, he asked them to call, you know, the foreman, the owner, the president. Kevin Otto was basically all of those people. Kevin eventually arrived on scene, spoke with Mike, said, oh, yeah, we'll get a trench box. And Mike said, okay, I'll wait. And that's what he did. And Mike was there later that day when the trench box arrived on the scene. He provided this literature to Mr. Otto and took a picture of it, which was, introduced as an exhibit at trial. By the time the trench box arrived on scene, it was 3 o'clock. They needed to wrap up what they were doing for that day. Mike left the scene. What happens the next day? Mike gets called back out. There's a worker in the unsecured trench, and he was issued a willful citation when he did that. And
This is your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. We filed a motion in limine as to these prior bad acts and to show his knowledge. One of the ways that we worked together is the JFK Federal Building and my grand jury are right across the street from each other. In the morning, Bob would conduct his depositions, which also served as my grand jury prep. We stopped for lunch, and then in the afternoon, they went into the grand jury. The feds, OSHA subpoenaed some documents. I also subpoenaed the same documents, but I did not receive the same documents. What happened was some of these documents were provided. We started looking at the signatures, as you can see here. This is Tony Teixeira here on the left. That is definitely not Tony Teixeira's signature on the right. And then what also happened was that we were getting documents for pre-job reviews for which Chris Barahona, who was actually a witness at trial, was out on medical leave. We knew all of these documents were false. And so what ended up happening is there were charges related to that. So Kelvin Maddox, as I mentioned, one of the victims in 2016, in 2007, also signed off on one of Mike Grover's reports, witness statements, thank you. And this was another document that was provided to us. That was the signature of Chuck Maddox that was provided on this document. That is the real signature of Kelvin Maddox. So after these 2 indictments for manslaughter for both Bobby Higgins and Kelvin Maddox, we also charged Mr. Otto with misleading a federal investigator. We also charged him with some evidence tampering, quite frankly, for not providing us with the documents that had been provided to the federal government when we went through our subpoena response. They were not there. They were not there because they knew that they were forged. But what we basically did was, charge both and only really proceeded at trial on the witness witness intimidation, which is what he was convicted of on a bench trial on both counts of manslaughter as well as witness intimidation. In terms of the deterrent effect, in terms of sort of what effect we can have as prosecutors, as a result of this case, the city of Boston passed an ordinance requiring the Maddox-Higgins affidavit of workplace safety. Employers do need to sign off on what their OSHA history is. The procedure, quite frankly, is that you can't get a permit without disclosing that OSHA history. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get the permit. You might need to provide, what you did to abate that citation. But it actually has resulted in a most recent prosecution. Somebody did not disclose it. And we have an ongoing case with both an individual and a company as a result of the Maddox-Higgins affidavit of workplace safety.